Hey, Nathan here. Welcome back to another C++ tutorial from PH Studios. Last weekend I was going to do some C++ videos for you guys, but I was sick, and I still have a little bit of a stuffy nose and a cough, so I do apologize, but I thought I'd get some of these videos out there for you. I'll probably do 2 or maybe 3 for today, and then obviously next week I hopefully will be feeling better to do a lot more than that. Okay, so last video we just discussed how to print to the screen, what the main method was, main function was, and how to create a project. In this video, we're going to discuss what variables are. Variables are sections of memory that contain data. You know, anything you do storage-wise in a program, it takes up memory. You see some video games require like 2 gigabytes of memory, or maybe more, or maybe less. That's because they store some values in memory. You know what your enemies are currently doing, what their states are. That takes up memory. So we're going to discuss a very basic way of storing stuff in a memory, and that's called variables. Now, they're very basic because they don't really store valuable information for video games. You know, in terms of video games, you want to store an entire object and what that object is doing, but we'll get to objects later. For now, we'll be discussing variables. So a variable is a section of memory that contains data. It's storage with an identifier, and some basic types are integer, boolean, char for character representation, long for a long integer, double for floating point, decimal point values, and there's also a float that is smaller than double. Double can store more than float can. And then there's signed variables and unsigned variables. Signed means that you can have a signed type, you know, it's either positive or negative. Unsigned means you cannot have a negative value, it has to be positive. Now, how do you work with variables? So those are the basic types. You can look up online for more types. There's a few more than that, like short, for example, for short integer. I'm not gonna discuss every single type in this video. We'll get into all these types throughout the series. But you see integer here, int. That's what we label as an integer. And how do we declare a variable? We declare a variable by typing in its type, in this case int, and then space, and then the name we want. The name we want for the variable. A variable cannot start with a number. It has to start with at least a character. x9, you can do that. But 9x, you cannot do that. So I'm just going to label that int x. Now, how do we store something in that variable? So we have int x here. Later in our program, we declared it so we can use it inside this function here. So later on in this function, we can say x is equal to 22. That will store the value 22 in the integer x variable. Alright, so we have 22 stored in x. Now if we want to display x, we just use the cout that we discovered in the last video. And we'll pass it NL in case we want to print other things. So now if we start debugging, and I left the sin.get so the window stays open, we'll see it says 22. So that's good. Now, what if you were to put a decimal value in here? So 22.8, what would show up? Does it crash, or does it display something to the screen? It'll display something to the screen. We lost that 0.8 though, because it's an integer, it cannot store that floating point data. We would have to say double or float for that. and then that will display that floating point value. Okay, so I'm going to delete these two. That's how to declare a variable and how to assign to that variable. Now, what if you want to do that all in one line? Well, that's pretty easy. You just combine those two lines into one. Int x is equal to 22. And then we start debugging, and it has 22. So that's a pretty simple tutorial. I just wanted to discuss how to declare a variable, how to assign to that variable, how to do that all in one line, and I discussed some of the built-in types. Integer is a built-in type. So is double, float, char for character representation, boolean for true or false. So before we close out of this video, let's talk about unsigned. So unsigned will be before the type you want to use. So in this case, unsigned int. Now unsigned int, we cannot do negative 22. If we try to do that, it'll do negative 22 from the max value. So let's say you want -1 inside the unsigned int. That'll give us the maximum value of unsigned int. So the maximum value of unsigned int is 429.496.7295. So now if we do negative 22, that will be that value minus 22. So you can use negative values inside an unsigned integer, but that will be subtracted. -1 will be the maximum value of that data type. And then any other value that is less than -1, so like negative 22, that will be 21. That will be the maximum value minus 21. So as you see here, it ends with 7.4. So add 21 to this gives us a maximum value of unsigned integer. Alright, so last thing on my list is to show you how to find out the minimum and maximum of a certain data type and how you can find that information out so you don't go higher than the maximum or lower than the minimum. So C++ gives us a nice way of doing that. Once we include the namespace std, we have access to a numeric underscore limits. If you do not have using namespace std, you would have to put the std : before that. But since we're using namespace std, we can just type it that way. And then we open with a less than sign, and then we can type in the data type. So in this case, I want to see what the maximum value of int is. And then close the bracket. And then ::, and then we have access to all these different functions here. One of those is max. So once we use that, we have opening and closing parentheses, and that will give us the maximum value. So that will be an integer, so I can store it in integer I. Int max value is equal to numeric limits of type integer, call it the maximum function. Alright, semicolon. And then let's see out this int max value. So now if we start debugging, that will give us the maximum value of integers. Change that to min and start debugging. That will give us the minimum value of integers. Let's change that to double, and then double, and then let's debug, start debugging, and that is the minimum value of a double. 2.22507E, That's times 10 to the negative 308. Maximum 1.79769 times 10 to the 308. So if you ever need to make sure that you're within range of the certain data type, you can use these values here, and that will give you the minimum or maximum. Alright, so that is it for this video discussing variables. You should know a few of the data types. You can find out more of the data types, and we'll obviously find out more of the data types as we go along. But those are just a few of the most common data types. For floating point values, you'd probably use float or double. For standard integers, you'd use int. For conditional statements, true or false, you would use a Boolean value. And for representation of a single character, you'd use a char data type. So next video, we'll discuss conditional statements. If your program, you want to do one thing if the value is a certain value. You want to do something else if it's not a certain value. Alright, so I hope to see you next time.